Okay, so pleasantries and opening stuff aside, we'll talk today about roles and identity, and specifically we're going to continue the roles and identity Zimbardo lecture, which we started last week. So you've by now all seen the Zimbardo film, which is very, very interesting, very, very messed up. And, oh, by the way, a few people complained that I didn't warn about the graphic language and absurd weirdness of the film. And for that, I'm sorry that I would now like to retroactively warn you that there's graphic, disturbing stuff in that film, and I'm sorry I forgot to do so beforehand. But continuing on, the key takeaway from the Zimbardo film and from the lecture about the Zimbardo film is the concept of the power of the situation. And the Zimbardo film illustrates this in several ways, but one of the clearest ways is that with minimal cues about what is the appropriate behavior in this setting, people fluently took on their roles, diligently took on their roles. Or the one guy, the John Wayne character who became a prison guard, became an incredibly abusive prison guard. He took on his role. He'd seen Kool Hand Luke the night before. He knew the rules. He knew the details of the part. And so when he was told, you're a prison guard, he did it with great imagination and verve. And then the prisoners totally took on their roles, right? They didn't really resist the guards. They kept track of the days on the side of the prison walls, even though at any point in time they could just leave. They tried to break out of the prison, but at any point in time they could have said, I would like to be released from this experiment. Instead, they tried to break out like a prison guard would. They tried to plot their escape. So this is one way to illustrate the power of the situation. Another experimental study, well, it's sort of I don't know if it's an experiment, but it's another famous social psychology study, which we'll talk about today. The Rosenhan experiment also illustrates the power of the situation, though in a somewhat different way. And the Rosenhan experiment sort of starts with this question of, how great is the power of the situation? If it was the case that under the surface you were the exact opposite of your role, how long would it take for you to be detected? Or would the cues and expectations that come with roles, social roles in social settings, be so great that you could be the exact opposite of your prescribed role and you wouldn't be found? You would instead be able to pass. So what am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about this experiment that was written up in the Rosenhan paper called On Being Sane in an Insane Place, which is totally one of the most kick-ass titles in the history of social psychology. So they took 8 sane people. Several of them were psychologists. There was a psychiatrist and a doctor. And Rosenhan made appointments at 12 hospitals for these 8 sane people to go to. Not just sane, most of them were mental health professionals. And what these mental health professionals did was they showed up at these mental hospitals, and they reported having heard voices. They reported having heard a handful of words, just a few words that they had heard, including the words empty, hollow, thud. They all said the same words, very strange, randomly picked words. But they otherwise represented themselves truthfully. So they showed up at these hospitals, and they said, I've been bothered a little bit lately. I've heard these voices. I've heard these 3 words. And otherwise, yeah, I'm feeling fine. I'm doing great. And all these people were admitted to the institutions with diagnoses of schizophrenia. And I believe they were all, none of them were like forcibly committed. They were all, they were all invited to stay. Oh, I'm like flicking this thing randomly. Sorry about that. So all were admitted to the institution with diagnoses of schizophrenia. And from there on, that's kind of when the experiment started. So they reported hearing voices. They were diagnosed with schizophrenia and, invited to stay in mental hospitals. That's not too weird, right? Now the experiment starts. From there on, all of these study participants acted normally. And until then, and they were interested in how long would it be until they'd be diagnosed as normal and released. If they had made a few minimal complaints, got the normal diagnosis that you would get when you report hearing voices, get put into a mental institution, how long, if they acted totally normally, acted like their authentic selves, which were, again, mostly mental health professionals, how long before they would be noticed and released? And the answer was a pretty damn long time. Their average stay was 19 days in these mental hospitals before being released. And the actual stays ranged from 7 to 52 days. And Rosenhan went public with these results, and it shook the world. I don't know if that's true, but I just decided to say that. And so why did this happen? Why did this happen that on average the people didn't get found out for like 3 weeks? Why is this? Well, the main reason, based on the qualitative data, what the people reported as far as their experience in the mental hospitals went, the main reason is that the situation made them seem crazy. Their otherwise normal behavior would be interpreted as insane because they were in an insane place. So the big takeaway on being sane in an insane place is a lot of stuff that you think is your normal behavior will be construed as insane if you're in a mental hospital where everybody's expecting you to fulfill the role of an insane person who's committed to a mental hospital. So there are a wide variety of examples. People, would talk to their therapists, and the therapist would say, like, they're strangely calm and at ease, or they speak, too quickly or too slowly and things like that. And these people think they're just acting normally. Again, most of them are mental health professionals themselves. And one imposter was taking notes the whole time because they're in the Rosenhan experiment, right? And they're like trying to take notes on their experience. And, an observer, one of the mental health professionals that was observing them said that their note-taking was pathological and obsessive, and among the symptoms of Jane, in the study is, she's pathologically taking notes all the time. What's wrong with Jane, So one thing that's kind of, okay, so the patients also, so there was also this thing where the patients themselves, having gotten committed to the mental hospital, would then, because of their environment, actually act a little bit more insane than they were. They would act nervous and freaked out because they're in a sort of nerve-wracking, tense environment in this mental asylum, and they would be surrounded with pretty mentally ill people who were in a tough state. So all of this was very unnerving. So to a certain extent, they acted more insane, being sane in this insane place. Suggesting that there's this self-fulfilling prophecy to being put in a mental hospital, where you're put in this very stressful, taxing environment, which makes you act a little bit more like maybe you fit in this stressful, taxing environment. And this is maybe my favorite part of the study, is many of the other patients who ostensibly are insane, I guess, or were committed for, were not in the study, basically. They got there through some more normal means. Many of these fellow patients actually suspected that these people were imposters and were sane, which suggests the very strange takeaway that perhaps the insane are the best judges of insanity, since they were the ones that were like, those people do not belong here. Those people are totally fine. They're normal. Their note-taking is not pathological. It is, they're probably in some study. So that's very interesting. The insane folks definitely were more attuned to this than were the mental health professionals, or so the study says. So this study was publicized, and I think the main purpose of the study from Rosenhan's perspective was to make light of the fact that psychiatry at that point in time was an inexact science, that mental hospitals were not so rigorously evaluating their clientele, that people could get better and they wouldn't be noticed. People could get worse and they wouldn't be noticed. This is not very long after the the electroshock frontal lobotomy period of mental treatment in the country, and actually, and still some of that's being used in the late 60s and early 70s. So Rosenhan was trying to make light of, as himself a mental health professional and a psychologist, how inexact this science was and how it needed to be reformed. Of course, this, in turn, when they published the study was much criticized. And some of these criticisms range from the very defensive, like there's nothing wrong with mental hospitals in America in 1971, to the very well-reasoned. For example, this guy Spitzer said, look, what is wrong with what happened in this study? What's wrong? If you were to go to a hospital and you were to complain of some physical problem and you manifested the apparent symptoms of that physical problem, the hospital would treat you for that physical problem, and they would hold you in the hospital for the prescribed normal amount of time following the treatment that's appropriate for you to heal, And so you went to a mental hospital, clearly, proclaimed yourself or gave off symptoms that are easy to diagnose as indicative of schizophrenia. You were diagnosed with schizophrenia accurately, put in a mental hospital, and then they released you after a little while when you'd acted like you didn't have schizophrenia anymore. So Spitzer's like, what's the problem here? What did you want to happen? Like you had symptoms, you were diagnosed, properly, and then you were given treatment. And it's a good point. So what's the big deal? Okay, so Rosenhan's at this point, he's on his heels. He's like, uh-oh, you know, looks like people are taking out my study and they're making some kind of good points. So for a follow-up study, he did the following. One hospital claimed that no such mistakes could be made at their hospital. They said, look, the result of this original Rosenhan experiment, they're all well and good, but those are just the bad hospitals, you know, the mental hospitals that are very imprecise. They're the ones that would commit somebody for hearing 3 words and then spend 52 days figuring out that they're not actually schizophrenic. Our hospital, this would not happen. So Rosenhan challenged them, essentially, to a test. Rosenhan said, I'll send several of my pseudo-patient people like these 8 mental health professionals that he had sent to begin with, and I'm going to send them there and see if they can get admitted to your hospital. You say it can't happen? Well, let's see. So the hospital kept careful track for the next month of the number of people who showed up and who got put in the mental hospital and who didn't. And so there are 193 people that showed up, 193 people who showed up for evaluation, diagnosis, and the hospital identified 41 as imposters. They said these 41 people out of the 193 are Rosenhan's people. He's cleverly sent these 41 people here to try and expose our hospital as imprecise and expose us as not knowing what we're doing. And then they said these 43 people, we're strongly suspicious that they might be imposters as well, but we're not sure. We're not sure. So we admit, right there, they're pretty much admitting this is a pretty imprecise science, right? In fact, Rosenhan had sent no pseudo-patients at all to the hospital, and the hospital didn't look very good. So, conclusions coming out of this study. So, psychiatry is, or at least was in 1971, a very inexact science, which shouldn't be shocking, right? I mean, social psychology is a very inexact science. We have kind of general concepts, general tendencies, things we call effects. We don't have carefully nuanced theories that are perfectly accurate, like you might find, or not perfectly accurate, but highly accurate, like you might find in physics or chemistry or even biology. So, why would we expect psychiatry to be perfect just because they're dealing with drugs sometimes? And most of their use of drugs is justified by, clinical trials. So this is not like egg on the face of psychiatrists. Some of my best friends are psychiatrists, yada, yada, yada. But it is, or at least was, a very inexact science. But for our purposes as social psychologists looking at the Rosenhan experiment, what should be the big takeaway that we think of as the big thing that we learned from the Rosenhan experiment? Well, I would say that it's further evidence for the power of the situation and for the specific aspect of the power of the situation. This aspect that situations carry with them expectations that can become self-fulfilling prophecies. That when a role is salient, a role that you're supposed to obey, not only will you be seen through the lens of that role, but also your behavior may fall in line with that role, even if you are under your skin the exact opposite of your role. Even if you are a mental health professional who's doing the minimal amount of acting to pass as a mentally ill person, you'll find yourself exhibiting behaviors that make you look like that person. You'll find people looking at you through a lens of expectations that you are that person, and for all intents and purposes, you'll be seen and you will be socially that person. So we tend to see what we expect to see, and when you treat someone like something, they may become that thing. And this is further evidence for the Thomas theorem, right? The Thomas theorem is this idea that situations believed to be real become real in their consequences. An idea that W.I. Thomas, the social psychologist, said is that all we need is for people to all subjectively perceive something to be real, and then the consequences that ensue will make it real. And that's what happened with the Rosenhan experiment. And so this is disturbing should you be sane in an insane place, right? Because you're probably not going to get seen. You're probably not going to get found out, and people probably won't know the difference. However, it might be reassuring if you suspect that you're insane in this supposedly sane place and you're trying to pass. So that's the takeaway from the Rosenhan experiment. And we will now... Oh, do you have any questions about this? Before we move on to the next lecture. Yes, sir?
Does this have any implications for, like, falsely convicted prisoners?
For falsely what?
Convicted prisoners?
Yeah, I think that the situation may be very similar for falsely convicted prisoners. Though they don't get released so much, once they, well, no, they get released when they have this track record of good behavior, and then, first opportunity for parole comes up. And yeah, it could be the case that if you were wrongly convicted, you get sent to prison, you become essentially a criminal by being in this kind of criminal deviant environment that brings that out. And you may find it very hard to make parole, even though you were innocent to begin with. So yeah, I think it would correspond with that pretty well. Other questions? Yes? Did the Confederates ever actually just ask to be released from the hospital? They didn't. That was where they drew the line. They were supposed to just sort of act normally and then see how long before the mental health professionals would say, we think you're fine, and we think you don't need to be here anymore. So that was kind of the test. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's move boldly onward into the future. And so today is the Grand Illusion showing, right? Excellent. Okay. So in advance of the Grand Illusion showing, I thought it would be useful for you to know what the assignment is that the Grand Illusion film corresponds with. So let's talk about that now. Okay. So this is that assignment. So pay close attention. This is on B-Space in the Roles and Identity Goffman lecture. Okay. So the Grand Illusion. You haven't seen this film yet, but I think you're going to like it. It's a really good film. Why wouldn't you, right? It's from 1937. It's French. It's black and white. It has subtitles. It has no actor in it you've ever heard of. I don't understand what's not to love, right? I mean, that's why you're all so excited. Despite that, I think this is a kick-ass film. And actually, when you see these lists of the greatest films of all time, The Grand Illusion often winds up #1. Have you ever heard of the Criterion Collection? It's this collection of DVDs, very fancy pants, art house films that have been issued in this DVD collection called the Criterion Collection. The Grand Illusion was the first one they issued. Why? Because it's the greatest film of all time. So this film is directed by Jean Renoir. Not Jean Renoir, the painter who painted the Boating Party and other stuff like that in the Impressionist era, but actually his son, who became a director. And I think The Grand Illusion is one of the great, great films of all time, and is one of the first great war films of all time. And one of the biggest things you want to watch for as you watch this film is illusions in the film. That's what the title is orienting you to, right? This film is going to be about illusions, social illusions, and you're going to try and figure out what is the Grand Illusion. And the illusions in the film, at least this is the way I teach this film, all tend to revolve around group differences. By the way, we'll do a more in-depth lecture on this on Thursday, but this is just so you can watch the film and know what you're looking for. So the illusions in the film all revolve around group differences. And the people in the film sometimes transcend these group differences and find commonality and similarity and communion across these lines of difference. And then sometimes they fail to transcend these differences. So what are some of these differences? These social cleavages that the film is all about. Okay, so officers and privates, cleavages between different ranks in the military. There are often these scenes with officers and privates not necessarily connecting or maybe triumphing over that cleavage between those levels in the Army and nonetheless connecting. Also, the prisoner-prison guard division. As you've seen from the Zimbardo film, this is a very significant social cleavage that's hard to connect across. Jew and Gentile. If you don't know, Gentile means not Jewish. And that's a social cleavage as well, especially in the time of this film, which is set during World War I. So in the 19-teens in Europe, the Jew-Gentile social cleavage is one of the most significant, if not the most significant perhaps, and end up propelling the rise of the Third Reich. Also, the distinction between nobility and commoners, which one thing to know as you watch this film is that the old European feudal system, where certain people are born nobles and are therefore by birth landowners and are better people, considered better people by birth than commoners, this system has died out in France with the French Revolution, which said we're getting rid of that old system, we're replacing it with a modern Western-style democracy like America has, because America is so cool, right? Okay. So, well, whatever your opinion of America, the democracy part is pretty cool. So, But then in Germany, it's still persisting. They still have this noble system where certain people are born into landed aristocrat positions and other people are not, and they're by birth not as good. So that's another basis of difference. Then there's the French-German difference. Obviously, it's World War I, and this is like a film about French and German people interacting. So this French-German difference is a big deal. There's also the difference between rich and poor, and people at sometimes will connect across that basis of social difference, that social cleavage, and other times they won't. So the film, in this way, exemplifies many ideas from social identity theory, which you'll learn all about on Thursday, but which you know jack about right now. Although the lecture for social identity theory and the lecture for the grand illusion are both posted on BSpace, so if you want to go check them out before or briefly after the film, go for it. It'll make the next two lectures more boring, but you know, you'll be more informed. Okay, so the prompt for the essay. What is the prompt for the essay? Identify 3 bases of group difference in the film The Grand Illusion. Explain how each basis of group difference either is or is not transcended, i.e. exposed to be an illusion in the film. So what you want to do as you do this, as you identify 3 bases of group difference that the people in the film either do or do not overcome to find connection with one another, you want to use specific evidence from the film, and you want to use at least one concept or piece of research from the social identity theory lecture and or the Stetson-Bertz article, which is on social identity theory and identity theory. So at least make reference to some concept or piece of research so that I have some sense that you're going to lecture. Obviously, all of you are going to lecture, but some of your colleagues are not. And then some sense that you're reading. So use at least one concept from the lectures or the Stetson-Bertz article. I'm overusing this thing. I apologize. I just really like using it. Okay. And definitely use specific evidence from the film, right? Because you have to do that to make any sense at all in responding to this prompt. Questions? There's more to this assignment, but yes. Good. Okay, I'll get to that. Okay, so actually, let me finish doing the assignment, and then we'll do the questions. So, first thing, you should have a thesis. You should have a thesis statement. On initial perusal of the Kuhl and Luke essays, we are concerned that you're not always doing the thesis thing. You got to do the thesis thing, and then support the thesis thing by doing the evidence thing. Okay. And if you do that, you can't do very bad. You're going to do at least pretty well. Can the two of you please stop talking? Thank you. Okay. So you should have a thesis, probably something on group difference in the film proving to be real, an illusion, or some mix. Since remember, the main thing you're doing in the prompt is identifying 3 bases of group difference in the grand illusion and explaining how they're transcended or not. Your thesis probably should refer to that. Your thesis should probably say, The Grand Illusion is a film about how bases of social difference are transcended, are readily transcended during times of war. Or it could be, The Grand Illusion is a film about how fundamental bases of social difference are incredibly difficult to transcend, and then you support that, okay? Or it's about how some social differences get transcended and some don't. Some kind of thesis statement like that would fit the prompt well. This paper will be graded, like A, B, C, etc. And an A paper will have a thesis, 3 bases of group difference, explain how the bases are or not transcended in the film. Illustrate them with evidence from the film, and discuss them with concepts or research from class, and do so using proper structure and clear language. I know that sounds like a lot, but if you do that, you'll get an A. Okay, and then more detail on the essay will be given in the Thursday lecture, where I'll talk about the film that you've just watched and how it connects to the assignment, and I'll really make this assignment very straightforward for you by the time we're done. So if you come on Thursday for the Grand Illusion lecture, it's going to really help. Do not miss that. Okay, structure. Answering your question, sir. 4 to 5 pages, double-spaced. Essentially the same structure as the last essay, the Kuhl and Luke essay. I want it 5-paragraph essay style, though again, it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly 5 paragraphs. Clear thesis statement is in the first paragraph, the intro paragraph. Usually it's the last sentence or second to last sentence of the intro paragraph. Actually, the way I usually do it is I say a couple introductory sentences, then I say the thesis statement that's going to be the main thing that I'm going to support. Then I give a sentence that explains the evidence that I'll give in support of it, like the 3 bases of social difference that I examine that are transcended in the film are X, Y, and Z. And then I move on to the first body paragraph and discuss X, the next body paragraph and discuss Y, and the next by paragraph and discuss Z, and then I go to my concluding paragraph where I restate the thesis and then try really hard to say some poignant sentence that somehow makes the essay seem more significant and dramatic and all that stuff. Do you know what I'm talking about? How you sit there and you try to make that last sentence where you're like, and that's why the grand illusion sums up all of life, and you try to do that. Okay, so questions about this 5-paragraph essay style? Yes? Oh, yes. Will this be at the media center? Yes, the film will be on reserve at the media center, I believe, tomorrow morning, or tomorrow by noon or so. Okay. More questions? Yes, sir. I don't think you'll be able to view it online. I know Netflix doesn't stream it, so and it's not like available online that I'm aware of. Yeah. What's that? Say it again. Oh, really? Oh, okay. All right. So someone's I don't know that this has all the parts in it, but this woman, it has every part. Okay, so this woman says that it's in 13 parts on YouTube, so that's one way to see it. That's amazing. It's in 13 parts. But what I would do is just come to the showing today. That's what I would do, because then you can watch it with everybody else, and you can yell and hoot and holler with joy over the amazing 1937 special effects. You can throw popcorn at one another. It'll be beautiful. Yeah. Is it in English? No, it's subtitled. Yeah. More questions? Yes, Christine. Where is it showing? Here, I think. No, it's. There's a B-Space announcement about this. Is it 5 or 5:30? I don't remember. 5 o'clock here. It's showing. Okay. All right. So a couple last things about format. Please have standard margins and fonts. And proofread your paper, and your paper is due Thursday, March 19th, so next Thursday. Okay? Questions about this? All right. The social identity theory lecture will be important to you. It will continue through to next Tuesday, so if you're trying to use material from that lecture, you might read ahead in it so you can knock the essay out early. Otherwise, you won't get all the content from the lecture in the lecture until next Tuesday, which still, I mean, most of you will do this in the 48 hours beforehand anyway, but should you be the kind of person who wants to knock it out on Sunday, just read ahead in the lecture slides and read Stetson Burke, and you should be good. Any questions? Okay, no questions. All right. Okay, so now, the next thing we're going to talk about in the class, because we're now in the sort of identity portion of the class, and right now we're focused on role identities, which we already defined in the Zimbardo lecture. So now, if you're going to talk about role identities, you're inevitably going to talk about this character, Irving Goffman. Who's heard of Irving Goffman before? Oh my God, looks like a bunch of sociology majors. Fantastic. So Irving Goffman is a very, very famous social psychologist, and since you've all heard of Irving Goffman before, you're going to know certain stuff about what Irving Goffman said. You probably know something about his dissertation, the presentation of self in everyday life, and so on. My purpose in this class is to give you, in this lecture, is to give you a sense of some of Irving Goffman's ideas that are relevant to the class. So this is just a hodgepodge of cool stuff about Irving Goffman. It is not a, here is, Goffman's total collected thoughts, and now you know Goffman when you're done. This is more like stuff Rob finds interesting about what Irving Goffman was talking about for 40 years. Okay, so let's start with a larger question. What is identity? An identity, the definition of identity, is a very useful definition. It's very possible there could be like a multiple choice question on this definition. Identity is defined as different selves that an individual may take on in social interaction, different ways the individual may view themselves. And the overall self is believed to be organized into multiple identities, and that those identities exist at different levels, different levels of specificity. Okay, so one level is personal identities, basically personality, and this includes your various approaches to interpersonal behavior, like you might be introverted, or you might be polite, or you might be gregarious, or you might be extroverted. So these are aspects of your personality, aspects of your personal identity, things that set you apart from other people. Also, emotional or psychological traits, characteristics you have. They aren't necessarily ways you go about interacting with others. They might be characteristics you have, like you might be an optimistic person, you might be moody. Again, these are aspects of your personal identity or personal identities that you have, parts of your personality. As you know, we don't do much on that in this class. We're not big on personality and personal identities because we're talking about situations and society and how that matters. Another level of identity is role identities. What are role identities? They're essentially positions in groups that have prescribed expectations for appropriate behavior. Go see the Zimbardo lecture for the full definition. So what are some examples of role identities? Well, we discussed this already. Student, friend, mother. Some of you are probably all three of those identities. If I was to list the role identities that I'm in, they would include, son, brother, Kansas basketball fan, big Kansas basketball fan, teacher, professor at Berkeley, etc. So these are positions that you hold in groups that have prescribed appropriate behaviors. Social identities. This is another basis of identity, and this refers to groups that you're a member of that you don't necessarily fit a specific role in that group. Rather, you and everybody else in this group shares one identity. It's not I guess Kansas basketball fan would be more like a social identity then. But anyway, okay. And these are self-meanings in terms of groups to which you belong. So these would include things like nationality, race or ethnicity, political party, and yes, I guess being a Kansas basketball fan would fit more into social identities because it's a group I'm in. And we're going to talk more about social identities starting in the next lecture. And for today, we're going to talk more about role identities and specifically the stuff that Goffman had to say about this. So this is useful to get from this the definition of identity and the three levels we think identities work at: personal, role, and social group. Yes?
It's somewhat confusing because students are groups, whether there is
It's a little bit confusing because students, for example, could be both a role identity and a social identity. And I agree with that point, but I would say that when you're a student as a role, it means different things in terms of how it would shape your behavior than when you're a student as in a social group. So for example, if you go to a Cal football game or something like that, and you're all worked up as a group, rooting for, for the team or for the shared group identity, that would be very much student as social group identity. Or let's say you were demonstrating against the university to oppose tuition hikes on undergraduate students or something like that. That would again be, student would be a salient social identity that would be motivating your group behaviors. Now, student as a role would be more like you show up to class and unlike the teacher, you listen and take notes and fill your appropriate role, which is complementary with other roles that are salient in the situation, like teacher would be the main one. So you can kind of see here where these are two different, this is a very good question, where the same idea of student could be two different kinds of identity depending on the situation. Okay. So, moving on. Personal identities, not covered in this class. We're not talking about that stuff. We acknowledge that they're important. If you're interested in personality, go take a personality class in the psych department. I highly advise Oliver John is an outstanding personality psychologist. He will teach you all about that far better than I could. Role identities. This we will be talking about in the class, so let's cover some basic principles about role identities. Okay, one basic principle is role conflict. And this is a concept that refers to when two roles are present in a situation and it leads to the experience of dissonance and frustration. So for example, you might be in a situation where you're a father and an undergraduate student and you get a phone call from your kid in class, which you better have the ringer off, and you all of a sudden feel dissonance and frustration because you have to respond to your demands as a father while also being an undergraduate student. Alternatively, you could be trying to be a mother and a girlfriend. You could be trying to be on a date while you have kids at home, and this could be dissonance producing because there's role conflict. Or you could be a friend and a student where you're trying to talk to your friend about what you guys did last night in this class, and I keep telling you not to. So role conflict happens when there are multiple roles present in a situation, and it produces dissonance and frustration, and we can all think of examples of that. Some other stuff. Role expectations affect how you're perceived. When there's a salient role, people see you through the lens of that role, and the big example of that is being sane in an insane place. Even if you were sane in an insane place, you'd be perceived as insane because of the weight of role expectations. Also, roles constrain and direct behavior. Roles don't just affect the way you're perceived, they affect the way you actually behave. And the big example of that is the Zimbardo study, the Stanford... Okay, thank you. The Stanford prison experiment, which is a great example of how roles constrain and direct behavior. And also the Zimbardo study exemplifies how subtle role cues can go a long way. If you just delouse people and book them and pick them up in a cop car, they'll start to mark off the days on the walls of their prison cell, even though they're not really in prison. And both these things are strong evidence for the power of the situation, as well as the Thomas theorem. Okay, so, and roles can have real effects on, roles can have real effects on a person. They don't just activate and direct behavior in a situation. They can actually wind up leaking through and actually shaping your stable opinions and attitudes and essentially your personal identities. Remember that thought often follows behavior, not just preceding behavior, that if a role identity compels you to behave in some way, then your thoughts may come to fall in line with that behavior. Remember that if I pay you just $1 to lie to somebody, you'll convince yourself that it wasn't a lie. Okay. And this is consistent with the labeling theory of deviance, which says that when we book criminals, we book criminals and put them in prison. Sure, they may have started as criminals, but when we're done labeling them as deviant and criminal, you better believe that they're criminal and deviant by the end of that process. Okay. Next we'll talk about Erving Goffman. Let's take a 5-minute break. Now, back to the lecture. What we were talking about when we broke and had a nice relaxing break was Erving Goffman. We just started talking about Erving Goffman. Who is this guy, Erving Goffman? He lived from 1922 to 1982, so he died kind of young, actually. And he was a professor here at Berkeley, actually, from 1958 to 1968. And in fact, there's many famous stories about Erving Goffman. Erving Goffman is a famously eccentric character, or was a famously eccentric character. He did sociology in a very distinctive way. He'd write these book-length treatises, these social psychological treatises, where he would interpret the world in terms of people acting out in a play. And this may have been a product of his very distinctive view on the world. He was sort of a social misfit, social outcast. And apparently he was just kind of constantly breaching, sometimes on purpose, sometimes perhaps not on purpose. He was an eccentric guy. I know I've had various colleagues of mine tell me stories about what it was like to spend time with Erving Goffman. One person said that they were at a party with him in Boston, and everybody's like, "Oh, Erving Goffman's coming over. Like, this should be interesting." And then he comes into the apartment and ignores everybody and goes directly into the kitchen, opens up the silverware drawer, and starts rearranging the silverware. For no apparent, and no one really ever knew what was going on. Another person told me that he was the kind of guy that would go over to a male professor's house for dinner and then immediately insult his wife's homemaking skills and stuff, and be like, "Oh wow, it's very strange you haven't worked in the garden for seemingly 2-3 years, and just immediately start breaching social etiquette blatantly." But then other people would give accounts like he could be a very, very nice guy, a very sweet guy if you could get to know him. And other people would say that he was very quiet, that he would sort of hang in the back against the wall and sort of watch everybody else and survey the scene and make his little theories. So that's Erving Goffman. He was a role theorist and much more. I don't know why I wrote that. That's funny. And he proposed, among other things, dramaturgical analysis. And what is dramaturgical analysis? It is the idea that you can view the world as a stage, that you can view the social world as a stage where people are acting out parts or roles. So in a way, he's the quintessential role theorist. And basically, the theory of dramaturgical analysis is summed up well by this Shakespeare quote from As You Like It. "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts," which is a great quote. Okay, Erving Goffman is famous enough to have his own trading cards. You will perhaps one day be this famous of a sociologist to where you will have your own trading cards. I love these trading cards because they actually outline his strengths and weaknesses. The weaknesses, maybe too cynical. Is any behavior real? Special skills accidentally invented postmodernism. I don't call that a skill, but whatever. And this is card 6 of 12. So if you really enjoy this, we can get you the other 11. And you thought this one was fun. I like this. There's an Anthony Giddens and structuration card. Good God. Okay. So, all right. So Irving Goffman has his own trading cards. That's totally irrelevant to his research. Okay. Goffman viewed life as a theater. That is the idea of dramaturgical analysis. People play parts or roles. And this idea is outlined in his book, which came from his dissertation, which was called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. And if you look at the way he wrote that title, right? He's saying that the self is something that is presented and enacted in everyday life. He is eschewing the idea of an authentic self that you walk around disclosing authentically. He's saying rather you're acting. You're presenting yourself in some sort of manner to everybody else. And among Goffman's ideas was the following idea, that people develop and maintain a shared definition of the situation. That people, again, you know the Thomas theorem, situations believed to be real become real in their consequences. He said that we all tend to kind of work together to maintain an intersubjective shared understanding of what's going on, be that accurate or not. Sometimes we'll get it wrong and we'll have a shared understanding of a situation that's wrong, like in the Zimbardo prison experiment. These were just normal people, but they believed they were in a prison. Can you two please be quiet? Thank you. But they had a shared definition of the situation, and that shared definition directed their behaviors and defined the appropriate ways that they would enact and present themselves in the situation. Okay, so this shared understanding of the situation includes expectations for appropriate role behavior, and everyone sort of participates in maintaining the fluidity of situations. And so Goffman sort of thought that, that we all want society and social interaction to move smoothly, and that's part of why he was always breaching, right? Because when you all went out and did breaching, one of the insights you get is that it makes people uncomfortable. It breaks the social fabric, and people kind of try to restore that social fabric. Yeah. So when people screw up their roles, other players in the play try to help them recover. Just like if you're in a high school play and you forget your lines, people will jump in and say, you know, oh, didn't you mean to say, wherefore art thou, Romeo, or whatever, you know. And then you go, oh, yeah, wherefore art thou, Romeo. Okay, so Goffman had this idea that you have a shared definition of the situation, and we all work together to sort of keep the play going smoothly, and we negotiate to try to keep a shared understanding of the situation and everybody's roles being enacted fluidly and properly. Okay, another idea of Goffman's is the distinction between front stage and backstage, which is an extension of his idea about dramaturgy. He felt that we have a front stage where we put on an act, where we do our social act for everybody else, but that we also have a backstage. And in the backstage is a bunch of stuff that's real about ourselves, things that we don't disclose to others, that we don't ever reveal in the presentation of self in everyday life, things that we don't share with others. And this was an idea, this Goffman's backstage idea was studied by an artist, the artist who did Post-Secret. How many of you all are familiar with the Post-Secret project? Okay, cool. So I think the Post-Secret project is totally interesting. About half of you or more are already familiar with it, but we'll review what the Post-Secret project is here in a second. Oh, and one thing I want to say, as long as you're talking about backstage, one of my favorite, maybe my favorite writer, Fyodor Dostoevsky, has a quote about the backstage where he says, "Every man has reminiscences which he would not tell to everyone but only his friends. And he has other matters in his mind which he would not reveal even to his friends but only to himself, and that in secret. But there are other things which a man is afraid to tell even to himself, and every decent man has a number of such things stored away in his mind." And this artist who did the Post-Secret project had essentially this concept in mind, that there's certain things that we try not only to not reveal to others in the presentation of self in everyday life, but there's things that we try not to even reveal to ourselves. And that's what the Post-Secret project was about. It was about, well, it started with an artist distributing postcards to people that he would then ask people to send back to him. They were addressed and stamped so they could go back to him. And they were supposed to put on these postcards secrets from their life. And one of the ideas here was that a collection of people's deepest, darkest secrets might be artistic. That's what the artist was thinking, is all, make great art from these secrets. But another idea is that perhaps disclosure of one's deep, dark secrets, even if it's just anonymously, just knowing somebody's going to read it, or maybe even just writing it down, who cares if somebody reads it, might be therapeutic. And that's an idea, this idea of self-disclosure as therapy, that we'll revisit later in the class as we read the Timothy Wilson book and do the last two essay exercises. So over time, people came to make these postcards, they tended to not just put down, some deep, dark secret about themselves, but also make them into art, communicate this secret in an artistic way. And I figured we could do some examples of these because they're very interesting. So now we'll go through a few examples of the postcards that the post-secret artist got when he distributed these postcards and asked people for their secrets. So here's one. There's another one. So if you find these interesting, which I do, there's actually a post-secret exhibit that will be at the Bedford Gallery in Walnut Creek from March 1st to April 26th. So you might want to Google this because I found it online. I think this is accurate, but don't drive to Walnut Creek and then they don't let you in and you're mad at me. Let's not, sorry about that. Right, there's actually a book with a collection of the post-secret stuff, and then there's also a website online where you can see a bunch of these. But the book is better. The book has way more stuff than the online, than the website does. But they're very, very interesting. And like I said, this idea of self-disclosure as possibly therapeutic is something we'll revisit later in the semester. So, oh, no kidding, yeah. Oh, okay, no wonder he's doing so many appearances near here. Okay, so yeah, so the post-secret guy's from Berkeley, which makes sense because we're awesome here in Berkeley. So what are some other ideas of Goffman's? Another idea of his is the idea of impression management. So what is impression management? Impression management involves self-presentation and impression management is your presentation of self to others and your careful management of that appearance to others. I guess I forgot to put a careful definition down. And in the course of impression management, you do self-presentation, but you also do self-disclosure. You also reveal something about who you are, even as you manage your appearance. So there's this process of revealing personal information in the process of relationship and friendship development. And by the way, women do this more than men do, the self-disclosure part of impression management, which is a pretty reliable finding across social psychological research. And self-disclosure usually produces liking and is expected as intimacy grows. However, too much self-disclosure, I think we all know some people like this who take self-disclosure to sort of absurd lengths, and maybe they ought to, chill it out a little bit. Chill it out. Okay. Another related idea, as long as we're talking about impression management, is tactical impression management. When you strategically try to put forward a presentation of yourself that is designed for some sort of personal ends or in order to impress other people. By the way, Goffman was very bad at this. Goffman was always breaching and stuff like that, but he also had no ability to actually act normal and behave in such a way that would increase other people's liking and esteem for him. That might happen. You might respect him or like him, supposedly, but it wouldn't be because he'd be strategically making that happen. There's a famous example that I was told by Neil Smelser, who's an emeritus professor in our department, that they had a running card game amongst the faculty in the sociology department, who at the time were all men in the early 60s. So they'd all hang out and, smoke cigars, or I actually don't know what they did, but I know they played cards. So they would all play poker, and apparently Goffman was the one that was the worst. Like, he had no ability to play poker effectively at all. He couldn't bluff. If he had like a pair of twos, he would just be elated, and it was just written all over his face. No ability. He'd be like, oh, I have my high card's a 10. Like, oh my God, how will I quiet my, excitement? He did not have an ability to do tactical impression management effectively. So tactical impression management is when we try to present ourselves in a false, exaggerated, or misleading way in order to get others to like us or maybe feel sorry for us, or gain control over valued resources or achieve some sort of material goals. Here you might think of the way that you present yourself in a job interview or something like that, or in office hours or something. Just kidding. You guys don't do that at all. No, you don't, actually. So what are examples of tactical impression management? The management of outward appearances, makeup, clothes that you wear, hairstyle, manner of speech that you affect. You maybe have one way of speaking and another one that you do when you're trying to make a really positive impression on people. I know when I go to the South, I'm from South Carolina, but I'm also from the Midwest, and when I go home to the South, I speak just a little bit different than when I do to the Midwest. I don't want to. I'd like to be a person with some integrity and consistency across situations. Apparently, I am not one of these people. Ingratiation. Here's an example of a method of tactical impression management. This is the use of deception to increase a target person's liking for us. And this includes opinion conformity. You can strategically agree with others, essentially use balance theory against them, right? Strategically agree with people so that they will then like you. And agreement tends to increase when the target is prestigious or admired or so on, possibly because you're more motivated to ingratiate yourself with these very prestigious or admired people. And this connotation of why it's effective, basically the reason that opinion conformity is effective for getting people to like or respect you is because it suggests to them that you like or respect them. Why else would you agree with their opinion? However, to be effective, you should intersperse occasional disagreements on trivial matters. This is a good thing. That way it doesn't look like you're purposefully agreeing with everything they're saying. This is all just Machiavellian methods for how you can do tactical impression management. Okay, so you should agree with people on the important stuff and then intersperse the occasional disagreements on totally unimportant stuff so they can't tell what's going on. Other stuff, other enhancement, which is a fancy word for flattery. You should always do this. This is big. The timing and frequency is very important. The timing must be careful so that they don't suspect that you're cleverly flattering them to gain favor with them. The frequency should be high. That's also important. Research shows this is tremendously effective. Flattery, you could go too far with this, but flattery almost always works. So remember that. But flattery, there's some research suggesting it's hard to fake, and that if you actually say stuff that's the opposite of what you internally believe, people will see through it, and they'll see that you're flattering them with clenched teeth and don't actually want to other enhance. Okay, other methods of tactical impression management. Self-presentation. You should exaggerate your own desirable qualities, such as competence, honesty, generosity. Some of you may not have these. You should pretend you have them. Very, very helpful. Also, at the same time, feign modesty, which is very, you're going to have to be very clever to pull this off. You'll need to amplify all your best characteristics without seeming as though you're amplifying your best characteristics. This is a challenge, but I think you can do it. Supplication. You can convince others that you're deserving of their help or favor by seeming inferior and essentially begging for their help or favor. This is an absolute last resort. Do not go first to this. Supplication involves belittling yourself, but it actually can be tremendously useful for eliciting other people's help. So you can, in a sense, exploit or exaggerate your own weaknesses to gain the sympathy and helping of people around you. And this invokes the social rule that you should help those who can't help themselves. So this entails a loss of respect, but perhaps a gaining of resources or help. Okay, but there's downsides to self-presentation. Self-presentation, excessive self-presentation and impression management may be hazardous to your health. So inflated concerns about how other people perceive you is stressful and can be bad for you. It can lead to anxiety in social settings. Also, deception can be hazardous to your relationships. Excessive impression management in romantic situations can often lead to a downward spiral of insincerity where at the bottom you find that the person you've portrayed yourself to be to someone else that you may like a lot is not the real person that you are, and they eventually figure it out, much like the film Wedding Crashers. By the way, did the last third of that film suck or what? They were really on to something, and then the last third, it just all fell apart, And then the end, it just didn't even make sense. Okay, so this undermines trust, excessive self-presentational, strategery can undermine trust. And one example of this is the marriage shift, which we'll talk about more in the relationships lecture later in the class. But that is the tendency that in long-term relationships, we tend to prefer for our partners to see us for who we really are. And so maybe early in a relationship, you want people to just see you really positively, but in the longer term, you want people to see you for who you really are. And so in that way, excessive self-presentation in a romantic setting can be very bad for you. Detecting deceptive impression management. How can you see that others are playing these very clever Goffman-like tricks on you? How can you detect other people's ulterior motives? Well, it's actually very hard to detect lying. Past research has shown detecting lying in social settings surprisingly difficult. You should look for nonverbal cues. They're more reliable than just about anything else. So nonverbal cues, often the ones that do help you are not the ones you would suspect, and the ones that don't help you figure out who's lying are the ones you thought would help you. So pitch of voice. When people are lying, the pitch of their voice tends to be just very slightly higher. And speech hesitation, people will sort of hesitate when they give responses when they're lying. So anytime you ever see speech hesitation, you're talking to a liar. Along the same lines, stuttering and stammering always means the person is lying. I'm joking, obviously. And if you were to ever talk to somebody who gives short answers, hesitates, and speaks in a high tone of voice, again, total like pathological liar. But note that eye contact, which most people think is a reliable indicator of lying, is unreliable. So you can't rely on eye contact. When people are avoiding eye contact with you, there's any number of reasons why that might be.